Hey everyone, tarekith here, and today I wanted to do things a little bit differently. Normally when I do a gear review, I like to spend a few weeks, even a few months, learning the piece of gear inside and out, using it for a few songs, even maybe like a live performance that I record. Um, this time though, I want to talk about the Roland MC707, something that's only been out for a few days. I've had mine maybe 3 or 4 days. I admit I've only had maybe 2 or 3 hours to use it. But I wanted to kind of give you my first thoughts on the device. And for me, this is kind of another video that I wanted to do for another reason. And that is the fact that there's one piece of gear more than anything that's kind of shaped the way I make music and how I think about the music creation process, even the music performance process. If you're a fan of my channel, then you know I'm really into Grooveboxes. I love the idea of having something you can just put in your lap or on a desk in front of you, just drums, synthesizers, sequencing, all that in one. A really focused music making interface you can just kind of get lost in. There is one device more than anything else over the years that's kind of shaped the way I think about that process, and that was the Roland MC505. Now this wasn't the first piece of gear I've owned. That would be the Korg X2, which was quickly followed by the MC303, which will make some people laugh, I'm sure, but the 505 more than anything else shaped the way that I think about making music. Real groove oriented, real pattern based. Not only that, it was the first device that got me kind of hooked on like online music communities and opened up so many doors to the career I have now, the friends I have now, and so much of my life. And one of the reasons that I'm kind of doing this video now about the 707 is the fact that tomorrow I'm actually getting rid of the 505. This isn't the first 505 that I owned. Sadly, the first one I owned I had to sell for reasons totally unrelated to anything I want to talk about. Just needed some money, got in a car accident, and had to sell it unexpectedly and not something that I really wanted to do. I spent about 10 years looking for another one that would be in good condition, and a few months ago I was lucky enough to find somebody here in Seattle selling one in Craigslist that was in more or less mint condition. So I've had this for a few months and it's brought back a lot of good memories, but at the same time, it's also pointed out that sometimes nostalgia is best left as nostalgia. I had a lot of good times playing on this interface, but it's a really slow box to use compared to today's equipment. The sounds are okay. I'm sure there's a lot of depth there if I really wanted to dive in, but to be quite honest, it was just really tedious to use. And at the time when I first had it, I didn't mind, but with today's tools like the 707 and things, I could just tell to myself that while I'd like to hang on to this, I would probably not use it that much. And the opportunity came up to give it to somebody else who was in the same boat I was. Were a big fan of the MC505, had been looking for one in good condition for a long time, knew that I would probably, with somebody took care of it. I replaced the display already. Those are known to fail if you're familiar with the 505. So yeah, tomorrow, something I looked for 10 years and only used for a couple months is going goodbye. And I kind of wanted to capture this on film one time before I got rid of it. And also I wanted to use this as a good point to compare with the 707, at least briefly, because I see a lot of reviews of the 707, or at least people who have read the press release about the 707, comparing it to the Roland Grooveboxes of yore and saying how Roland's lost their way. And I'll be honest, I'm not quite sure I understand that as somebody who has used this 505 quite intimately and quite recently, as a matter of fact. So let's dive into one of its successors, the MC707. This showed up about 3 or 4 days ago. I pre-ordered it from Sweetwater and got one of the first units. Compared to the 505, obviously it's quite a bit smaller, but it's still a pretty big unit. I also have the TR8S, which I was a big fan of. When I got the TR8S, I actually could immediately see that Roland had taken a huge step forward in the Groovebox market. While it's not marketed as a Groovebox per se, the fact is you could load your own samples, open up a ton of possibilities, and I really saw a lot of possibilities there of how I could use that as a standalone device for live performance. I never quite got it there. I use it more as a drum machine, which is, you know, what it is, which is fine, but I always thought that like if Roland had taken it just a little bit further, it would have made a really, really awesome Groovebox. So I was pretty surprised and happy when they announced the 707 recently. Like all the gear that I buy, before it arrives, I always read through the manual. Roland's been pretty good about having the manuals up online beforehand these days. They've even been updating it quite regularly. Often I would go to the website and see that the page for the manual was down because they were making changes to it. And I also say that they're also updating the OS quite regularly so far. I believe it shipped with 1.0, OS 1.0. Mine came with 1.01, and 1.02 has already come out with some pretty big changes. So it seems like Roland definitely is interested in kind of taking this a little further and listening to some initial requests to kind of fine tune things. So I wanted to give you my first thoughts on this. I've had it. I'll admit the manual itself, I really am not a fan of. And when I say the manual, I mean the owner's manual and the reference manual, which is like the full in-depth description of what everything does. All the information is there. It's just worded kind of strangely sometimes, and there's diagrams that don't make a lot of sense. You know, when you see a diagram like a signal flow chart, it should make things easier to understand, not more complicated. And in a way that kind of sums up my initial thoughts about the 707. A lot of what I might point out in this review, or maybe not review, first thought video, might seem negative, and I don't mean it to be that way. I just want to point out things that stuck out to me initially. There's a lot of hype about this, and I'm seeing a lot of people like gushing over it, and for good reason. There's a lot of really amazing things this does, but there's also some things I think people should be aware of if they're considering this, especially given all the competition these days. The first thing I'll talk about, like I said, is the size. It's a little bit bigger than a TR-8S, but roughly the same size, same build. It's got the same kind of like aluminized top with plastic sides. I don't mind. I mean, it's the 505 that I own was all metal, but it weighs a ton, and this is nice and portable and lightweight. It still feels pretty solid like the 8 or the 8S does. We have a bunch of assignable outputs now, which is really, really nice. It comes with an 8GB SD card, which is really, really nice. You don't have to buy a separate one like I did with the TR-8S. It even has a little kind of safety catch on the SD card so nobody can reach up and steal it from you. It's got 2 MIDI outputs and 1 MIDI input. Initially, I'll be honest, like I'm surprised that they put such a focus on MIDI output, because this isn't really a MIDI control center for your studio. You know, you can... Each of the 8 tracks on here can transmit MIDI, but it's really not. I'm reading reports that it doesn't actually record pitch bend and things like that. It's not really a MIDI hub for your entire studio. It does some really rudimentary MIDI things, but if you're looking, you know, to control a bunch of hardware synthesizers with just this, it's probably not going to be the best option, at least right now. There's also headphones output. One of the things Roland's done really, really good about this device, which I wish more Grooveboxes had, is they make it really easy to queue up individual channels with the headphones. So as you're performing, you can actually like queue up a sound before you send it out to the crowd. You can actually hear what you're going to do before everybody else does, and that's really easy to do. It has a USB port, which you can stream all 8 channels over USB to your DAW. It does require a driver. It's not class compliant. Personally, it's not a big deal to me. Class compliant would be really nice, but it's not a deal breaker, considering you can stream all 8 channels over USB to Ableton Live or Logic or whatever your DAW happens to be. It's got the same kind of wonky little power switch the TR-8S had. I mean, it works, it's fine. I wish it had like a nice chunky rocker switch instead. It just feels, a little cheap for the price of the device. I mean, this is almost $1,000 US. And like the TR-8S, it also has a cable lock for the PSU, the power supply. It is an external power supply. I'm happy they have a cable lock in here so you can't accidentally pull it out, but at the same time, like the TR-8S, it's in a really weird location. If you actually use this, it kind of blocks the power switch. It's not easy to get to because this cable lock sort of blocks the way the cable routing goes. Again, it's a minor point. It's not a huge deal, but I'm kind of surprised that maybe Roland didn't learn their lesson from the first time around. Keeping on with the hardware, most of the knobs are the same as the TR-8S. They're solid, they feel really good. I have no complaints about them whatsoever. There's 4 encoders here. You can push them to turn values faster or slower. They're basically soft encoders. You can also push them as buttons to operate certain functions. Those I have no problems with. The start-stop button is basically the same button as the TR-8S step buttons, I guess you could say. It feels fine. I was actually more impressed with those on the TR-8S than I thought it would be from the pictures. They feel solid, they feel reliable, they're nicely lit. The pads themselves, I'll be honest, they're not great. They're not terrible, but I've seen some people say they look like they're comparable to, say, Ableton Push 2 or Machine MK3, and at least in my experience, they're nowhere close. I find they're a little better than that single sort of velocity sensitive pad on the TR-8S, which I had double triggers with or found I'd hit really hard. I still have to hit these pretty hard to get a full range of velocity. They let you change the velocity settings. There's like linear, exponential, and there's fixed velocity settings in the setup you can use. But even with those settings, like it's not the most sensitive controller I've used. It's not bad. It's maybe a step up from the Novation Circuit or the Korg Elect Drive, the newer versions of the Elect Drive. But overall, I wish they were a little more sensitive. I don't think it'll be a big problem, and certainly it's a huge step up from the chiclets on the MC505, but for a device that costs $1,000, they're not great. I kind of felt the same way about the Electron Analog Rhythm MK2 pads. They're not bad, they're fine, they work. You know, if you hit them hard enough, you'll get your full velocity range, but at the same time, like there's so many better options out there these days that I wish they kind of would have stepped up their game a little bit on that. The rest of the buttons feel fine. They're solid. They're lit up brightly. You can change the contrast and the brightness for all the buttons and sliders. You can change the colors for the sliders as well, just like on the TR8S. That kind of stuff is really, really easy to do. One of the benefits of the MC707 over, say, the Roland TR8S is that there's a lot more, I don't want to say shortcuts, but it's easier to navigate to certain sections that you need, like the sequencer or your utility settings. You definitely have a lot of reliance on the screen still for certain functions, but you're not scrolling through endless lists like you are on the TR8S. Things are broken up more. There's dedicated buttons for a lot more functionality on the MC707. That said, certain things like the Synth engine have a lot of parameters, especially since you access most of those settings via only these 4 endless encoders. The Synth engine itself sounds amazing. There's a lot of possibilities there that Roland's kind of pulled from their past synthesizers. This is a brand new synth engine. There's 4 partials you can use if you're familiar with the Roland terminology. And now you can actually do different interactions between partials like Xmod and FM, things like that, which you couldn't do on earlier Roland synths. At the same time, this thing has 64 voice total polyphony, and I know that there's certain things like if you use the 4-pole filters, those actually will half your polyphony, so you could potentially end up with only 32 voices. And I'm still have to dive in deeper on this. Like I said, I haven't spent a lot of time with it yet, but I have a feeling that there's other catches that will limit your polyphony even more. There's only 8 tracks in total, so hopefully it's going to be a problem on, say, the Elect Tribe, like it was with the Elect Tribe, the newest Elect Tribe, but it's still something I think you're going to have to be aware of. The drum sounds are samples now. They're not the ACB settings of the TR8S. Overall, the individual samples I think sound pretty good. The drum kits they give you I think are pretty generic. It's your standard 808, your 909, your 606. They have like EDM kits and things in there. A lot of the stock kits are okay. I wasn't blown away by them like I was with the TR8S. That's not a big deal because it's not that hard to program your own kits from all the individual sounds. The other thing that's kind of stood out to me initially, again, I'm not going to go into a full review of this. It's just a quick overview with after a few playthroughs. The effects are really, really good. You not only have a lot of the reverbs and things from the later Roland modules, the Integra and the SP series, things like that, but some of the guitar processing and the guitar effects in here are really good. I haven't actually run my guitar into it, but just having those kinds of distortions and delays and things, those modeled effects from the guitar series on board and ready to process your synth sounds with is actually really, really nice. I kind of hinted to a little earlier that the manual I find really difficult. With all the gear I buy, I always read the manual first before I actually buy it or while I'm waiting for it to arrive. And I've been through the 707 manual a couple times just sitting down with the manual. It's not an easy read. Just the way it's kind of organized. It's really difficult to describe. Like all the information is there. It's just not easy to find. It doesn't make sense when you first read it. It's not written well, basically, is what I want to say. I really hope Roland kind of goes back and kind of cleans up some of that. It makes it sound a lot more confusing than it is. On that note, when I first sat down with this, having read the manual a couple times first, I was still a little baffled and trying to fumble my way around to find things. The basic navigation is there. It's easy to go from clip view or note view or search for drum kits and things like that, but some of the deeper editing functionality kind of eluded me. It looks like you only have 4 bars per measure, but it sounds like, from what I can tell, you can actually have up to 128 steps, and you can change the step resolution to get to that point. But again, the manual is kind of very unclear about this. A lot of people are like, well, how can you access 8 patterns? with only 4 buttons on the measure button. Things like that I think Roland could really do to kind of clear things up to make it easier for new users to understand. The other thing that kind of struck me about this is it's much, much deeper than I expected. This isn't something where you can just fire up a bunch of presets and have preset patterns and preset sounds and just get to work right away without actually knowing much more about it. I mean, the basics you can. It's not hard to kind of like play a bass line and quantize it and things like that. But if you want to get any deeper editing, or if you wanted to get into like automation editing, things like that, you can do it on this, but it's not super intuitive, at least without reading the manual a few times. Again, maybe it's just me and I'm having problems understanding it, but there's a lot of functionality here that I didn't expect. Kind of like the MC505 in a lot of ways. If you're familiar with older Roland Grooveboxes, like the synth editing is very deep. The sequencing is very deep, much deeper than you expect for something that's almost 20 years old. At the same time, I think that a lot of people maybe aren't expecting that. They're used to the more modern way of doing things, like with the Novation circuit or the Korg Elect tribes, where it's more immediate. I think it's a good thing there's a lot of depth to this unit. You can set up a lot of, it's easy to program your live setup the way you want, so it's easy to perform, but it's going to take a lot of steps ahead of time to actually get it to that point. Would probably be the easiest way to understand it. As strictly like a studio tool, I think the sound engine alone is great. There's a ton of presets on here. I think Roland is quoting around 3,000 presets, but I think it's important to point out that that's not just presets and kits. That's probably also incorporating the individual drum samples that are included. Still, I mean, that's a lot of sound. So even if you don't want to dive into the synth editing, there's a lot here to keep you busy for a long time. Anyway, I just kind of wanted to share my first thoughts on this. It's a lot deeper than I thought. It's going to be a lot more complex than I thought to learn. On one hand, I was a little put off at first. I'm so used to more modern gear these days where it's pretty straightforward. This large-ish display makes things easier. At the same time, there's still a lot of reliance on it, like the TR-8S. Like if you're going to get really deep into synth programming, like you're going to be spending a lot of time just staring at the screen. One of the nice things about the 707 compared to say the 8S is these knobs here, you can freely assign anything you want. On the 8S, there's only one row of knobs, basically one knob per channel that you could freely assign. The rest were fixed at pitch. I'll be honest, I forget the other one off the top of my head. You can freely assign all these knobs now. Roland's actually got a dedicated button for this. It's really easy to quickly get in there and like assign those things. At the same time, like if you're a person who wants to tweak a lot of synth parameters live, like you will have to kind of learn the menu structure of the synth setup and where to find the parameters you want. If you want to tweak more parameters, then you can assign to the 3 knobs per channel. So yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, it sounds a little negative, like I find a lot of faults with this. That's not really the case. I'm actually pleasantly surprised that it's as deep as it is. The synth sounds are really great. They're modern. The individual drum sounds sound really good. The effects are good. You have an EQ per channel. You have a master reverb, a master delay, a master effect. Trying to think what other things have stood out to me. There's no way to kind of like export your sounds, like you export your patterns, things like that. Like if you want to like export stems and whatnot, there's no easy way to do that. You can load samples in this, obviously, and use those in your drum sounds, in your drum kits. I believe the sample memory is about 60 megabytes. I've also read that it's got a built-in looper. Actually, I know it's got a built-in looper, but I've read that the looper itself only has about 60 seconds of total sampling time per project, and that 60 seconds is separate from the sample access you can use for your drum kits. In a way, that's good that they separated that, but it's still not a lot. You're looking at the same things like the Novation circuit, which is quite a bit cheaper. I believe you can use stereo samples at least, which is very nice. The looper itself looks pretty easy to set up. You can sample your master output, individual channels. You can sample external inputs. Speaking of external input, it's got a dedicated send and return. So if you have a really cool effects pedal you want to incorporate, you can do that. It's got assignable outs. So you can assign certain channels to separate outputs if you need to. There's not an assignable out for every single one of the 8 tracks. Personally, I don't care. I always use stereo outs, but I thought I would point that out. So yeah, there's a lot going on in this little box. Overall, it's pretty easy to get the sort of first layer of complexity to kind of navigate the very basics, but when you want to get deeper into editing, if you want to copy measures or copy patterns, things like that, I find that a little more confusing and not quite as intuitive. I plan on spending the next few days here that I'm not going to work, just kind of focusing on this and really spending all my effort to learn it inside out as much as I can. And once I feel comfortable and I've used it on a few more songs, or maybe hopefully even some live performances, which is what I really want to do with this, I will come back and give a much more detailed review. But I thought I would kind of share my first thoughts with you, having had this for a few days now and gone through the manual a couple times and spent a few hours playing with it. And I also kind of wanted to also compare it to the MC505, which I was happy to have again, but sadly is leaving me tomorrow. So this is kind of an homage to that, and I'm glad to see that kind of Roland is carrying the torch forward with something new and a little more cutting edge than some of the Grooveboxes they've had available for the last almost 20 years. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, put them in the comments. I'll be honest, if you're asking me individual specific questions about the synth engine and things like that, I'm probably going to point you to the manual so I can learn a little deeper. But if you want to know my impressions about things on this box, having used it for a while, at least a little while, I'm happy to share those in the comments. Thanks for watching, and tune in soon for a lot more information about the Roland MC707.